Long before history learned how to write its own name, memory was already under siege. Cities appeared fully formed where mud huts should have stood. Mathematics surfaced before counting stones. Stars were mapped before calendars existed. Across the ancient world, the same impossible pattern repeats: sudden knowledge, precise engineering, and teachers who were never born human. Clay tablets from drowned ages whisper of watchers, beings who observed, instructed, and governed from a vantage point beyond time. They did not inspire civilization slowly, they installed it. Irrigation systems arrived without trial and error. Law codes emerged without precedent. Architecture aligned itself to heavens no one should have known how to calculate. These are not legends drifting from ignorance. They are records, fragmented, technical, and disturbingly consistent. If these sources are taken at face value, human civilization did not rise alone. It was managed, corrected, and periodically reset. What follows is not mythology retold for comfort, but a reconstruction of an ancient operational reality buried beneath religion, catastrophe, and deliberate forgetting. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. The first fragments did not look like myths. They looked administrative. Broken clay tablets pulled from the lowest layers of Eridu and Uruk were not poetic, not symbolic, not devotional. They were technical. Lists, descriptions, procedures, the kind of writing that exists to preserve operations, not beliefs. These tablets date to roughly 3,200 BC, yet they describe events already ancient to their authors, referring to a time when the land had not yet been separated from the waters, and when instruction came from above, rather than emerging from human trial and error. The scribes who impressed these symbols into clay were not inventing a past, they were recording inheritance. Eridu, which the Sumerians themselves called the first city, sits atop 17 distinct occupational layers. Archaeology expects gradual improvement, crude foundations evolving into refined structures over centuries. What excavators found instead was discontinuity. The deepest levels show architectural competence that appears complete from the outset. Load-bearing walls aligned with cardinal directions, drainage systems that assume prior hydraulic knowledge, and standardized proportions suggesting mathematical planning. There is no visible apprenticeship phase. Civilization does not crawl here. It arrives. The texts tied to these levels speak of beings known as the Abgallu, a term that translates awkwardly as great water sages. The name itself carries imagery. Entities associated with the subterranean freshwater ocean, the Abzu, a concept the Sumerians used to describe the vast, unseen reservoir beneath the earth, imagined like a hidden sea feeding springs and rivers. These Abgallu were not gods in the later sense. They were instructors, engineers, advisors. They taught irrigation, metallurgy, agriculture, and city planning, not gradually, but as a package. According to the tablets, this instruction occurred during what modern scholars label the Ubaid period, roughly 5,500 to 3,800 BC. But the label hides the anomaly. The sudden appearance of long-distance trade, standardized tools, and advanced farming techniques across southern Mesopotamia suggests coordination. The tablets claim coordination existed because it was supervised. The Abgallu did not simply teach skills, they transmitted the MI. The MI were not laws or morals, they were operational decrees, the underlying principles that governed how civilization functioned. Think of them less as commandments and more as source code. One tablet from Uruk, catalogued in modern archives as a routine inventory document, casually mentions that the Watchers opened the eyes of the black-headed people, the Sumerian phrase for humanity. Opening the eyes did not mean spiritual awakening. In context, it meant enabling perception, understanding measurement, timekeeping, planning, and abstraction. Civilization requires seeing patterns before they exist physically. The tablets insist this capacity was granted. The Watchers themselves are described with unsettling consistency. They are said to observe from the heights of heaven, a phrase that in Sumerian does not imply clouds or mountaintops, but elevation beyond human reach. Linguistic analysis shows the root words emphasize seeing across distance and duration. These beings could perceive events before they occurred, a concept presented not as prophecy, but as advanced foresight, like someone standing on a hill watching travelers approach long before those in the valley notice movement. The Sumerian king list, compiled around 2100 BC, but drawing on earlier records, reinforces this framework. It begins with a time before the flood, when kingship descended from heaven. The reigns listed are absurd by human standards, tens of thousands of years. This has often been dismissed as exaggeration or symbolic numerology, yet the text itself treats these reigns as administrative facts, listing cities, rulers, and succession order with bureaucratic precision. Myth does not usually bother with accounting. 7 sages appear repeatedly in these records, each assigned to specific kings. They are not worshipped, they are deployed. The first, Adapa, is described as one who completed the plans of heaven and earth. Completion implies a blueprint existed. Adapa's story includes an incident where he breaks the wing of the south wind, halting atmospheric movement. This is often retold as folklore, but within the system described by the tablets, winds were part of a managed environment. Disrupting them was a technical offense, not a moral one. Another sage, Uana, is described by later Babylonian historian Berossus as amphibious, emerging from the Persian Gulf by day and returning to the sea by night. This description has been mocked as fantastical, yet the text emphasizes function over appearance. Uana taught writing, mathematics, and temple construction. The fish imagery aligns with the Abzu association, knowledge coming from the deep, from a realm inaccessible to ordinary humans. Whether literal or symbolic, the message is consistent. These beings did not originate within human society. What matters is not whether they wore scales, but that every major civilizational skill appears attributed to them. The remaining sages, Enmeduga, Enmegalama, Enmebuluga, An-Enlilda, and Utu Abzu, are each assigned domains that together form a complete infrastructure: law, measurement, metallurgy, astronomy, and governance. Nothing essential is left unaccounted for. The tablets also insist these beings worked directly with early rulers. Kings were not autonomous, they were intermediaries. Governance was a partnership, with humans executing policies they did not design. This is why early cities appear planned rather than organic. Streets align. Temples correspond to celestial markers. Agricultural cycles synchronize across regions. This level of coordination requires centralized oversight. Language itself preserves the memory. The Sumerian term for watcher evolves through Akkadian into roots that later appear in Aramaic and Hebrew. The continuity is unbroken. When later texts speak of watchers observing humanity, the concept is already ancient. It is inherited, not invented. Archaeology adds weight to the texts. Sites like Tel Es-Sawan show irrigation canals laid out with mathematical precision around 6000 BC. Pottery patterns encode astronomical cycles with accuracy that requires long-term observation. The builders were not experimenting. They were applying known models. Similar patterns appear at Jarmo in the Zagros Mountains, where architectural proportions mirror those used thousands of years later in sacred architecture. Geometry appears before theory. This convergence creates a problem for conventional timelines. Knowledge that should take millennia to develop appears fully formed. The tablets provide an explanation that archaeology alone cannot. Instruction occurred before history, by entities whose role was to establish, monitor, and adjust human civilization. The Watchers did not create humanity, according to these early records. They managed it. They installed systems, corrected failures, and preserved knowledge against catastrophe. The earliest texts do not present them as gods demanding worship, but as supervisors enforcing structure. Only later, as memory degraded and catastrophes intervened, did reverence replace understanding. By the time these stories were written down, the Watchers were already gone, or at least no longer openly present. The tablets read like technical manuals written by people who no longer fully understood the systems they inherited. They preserved what they could, impressed into clay, hoping the future would remember what the past could not afford to forget. The authority structure behind the Watchers becomes clearer when the tablets stop describing instruction and begin outlining jurisdiction. The earliest Sumerian records do not portray the cosmos as chaotic or mystical. They describe it as administered. Heaven, earth, waters, and atmosphere are divided into operational domains, each governed by specific overseers. At the top of this hierarchy stands a council, later known as the Anunnaki, a term meaning those who came down from heaven. Not metaphorically, but spatially. The phrase implies descent from a higher operational level to a lower one, like supervisors entering a work site. Three figures dominate this structure: Anu, Enlil, and Enki. Their roles are not interchangeable, and the tablets are precise about boundaries. Anu's name derives from the Sumerian word for sky, but the sky here is not clouds. It is the uppermost domain, the region of command and decree. Anu does not build cities or teach humans directly. He issues the foundational directives that govern cosmic order. Think of him less as a king and more as a system architect. Administrative texts from Nippur and Uruk describe Anu's authority as extending over what they call the highest heaven, a conceptual space where decisions affecting multiple domains are made. Boundary stones known as kuduru, which functioned like legal documents carved in stone, specify territories under Anu's direct jurisdiction. These include mountainous regions to the north, particularly areas corresponding to modern-day Turkey and the Caucasus. Mountains mattered because elevation symbolized proximity to the command layer. Certain peaks were declared off-limits to human settlement, not for religious reasons, but because they remained occupied. Enlil's domain sits below Anu's, both literally and functionally. His name combines words for lord and wind, but wind in this context refers to the entire atmospheric system. Enlil controlled weather, air movement, and agricultural cycles. Hymns dedicated to him describe storms, rainfall, and seasonal timing as outputs of his authority. These texts read less like prayers and more like performance reports, attributing successful harvests or devastating floods to adjustments made by Enlil's domain. Excavations beneath the Enlil temple at Nippur revealed underground chambers that extend far deeper than required for ritual storage. These chambers include ventilation shafts designed to maintain airflow even when sealed, suggesting long-term occupation or use. Carved reliefs inside depict devices that resemble monitoring instruments. Circular forms connected by channels, accompanied by inscriptions referencing wind, pressure, and balance. The implication is clear. Weather was managed, not merely endured. Enlil's authority covered central Mesopotamia, including Babylon, Kish, and Sippar. Administrative tablets from these cities reveal coordinated agricultural planning across vast distances. Planting schedules, irrigation releases, and harvest times were synchronized. This level of coordination requires centralized data collection and forecasting. The texts credit Enlil with the knowledge to read the sky, meaning the ability to interpret atmospheric and astronomical indicators to predict outcomes. Enki's domain differs entirely. His name combines Lord with earth, but the earth here is not soil. It is the subsurface, the Abzu. Enki governs freshwater, minerals, and the processes that shape living forms. Later myths portray him as clever or trickster-like, but the earliest records show him as a problem solver. When systems fail, Enki intervenes. Eridu, Enki's primary center, provides physical evidence of his specialization. The site contains one of the earliest known hydraulic systems, a network of channels and reservoirs controlling water flow with precise gradients. These gradients are calculated to regulate pressure and prevent erosion, principles that modern engineers recognize as foundational to fluid dynamics. There is no experimental phase visible. The system works from the beginning. Texts associated with Enki describe his ability to purify water, extract metals from ore, and shape the clay people. Clay is a recurring metaphor, but in Sumerian thought, clay represents biological matter, something moldable, responsive to intervention. Enki's role includes modifying existing life to meet operational requirements. This is not presented as creation from nothing, but as adjustment. The tension between Enlil and Enki appears repeatedly in the tablets. Enlil prioritizes control, stability, and population management. When humans become too numerous or noisy, he advocates reduction. Enki favors instruction and adaptation. He seeks to solve problems without destroying the system. This philosophical divide surfaces most clearly in flood narratives, where Enlil supports a complete reset while Enki secretly preserves selected humans and knowledge. Authority within this system is maintained through objects known as the Tablets of Destinies. Despite the name, they are not symbolic fate tablets. Texts describe them as devices that grant control over natural forces and administrative authority. They are said to shine, emit sound, and respond only to authorized handlers. When the bird-like entity Anzu steals them, chaos ensues, not because destiny is lost, but because command access has been breached. Descriptions of these tablets emphasize material qualities inconsistent with clay. They are said to be durable, luminous, and capable of transmitting decrees instantly. In modern terms, they function like secure command interfaces. Control of them determines who can issue binding orders across domains. Human rulers enter this structure as intermediaries. The Sumerian king list describes early kings as possessing extended lifespans and enhanced abilities. These are not portrayed as rewards, but as requirements. To interface with non-human authorities and manage advanced systems, humans needed modification. Texts describe preparation processes involving direct intervention by the Anunnaki, producing rulers capable of sustaining the role. Over generations, these enhancements diminish. Later kings rule for decades instead of millennia. Their authority becomes symbolic rather than functional. As direct oversight recedes, the system degrades. Knowledge fragments. Ritual replaces operation. What was once technical becomes sacred, yet the structure remains embedded in cultural memory. The division of heaven into paths associated with Anu, Enlil, and Enki appears later in Babylonian astronomy. Hebrew texts preserve echoes of watchers assigned to regions. Even later religious hierarchies mirror the administrative tiers described in these early tablets. What emerges is not a story of gods demanding worship, but of a managed world overseen by entities operating within defined roles. Humans were integrated into this system as workers, administrators, and eventually custodians. Civilization, according to the earliest records, was not an accident. It was an installation. The first system failure described in the tablets is not moral, it is logistical. Humanity multiplied faster than its infrastructure could support, and the oversight framework strained under the load. Early texts describe human settlements expanding beyond planned limits, resource extraction increasing without coordination, and noise rising to levels that disrupted what the tablets call the rest of the overseers. Noise here does not mean sound alone. In Sumerian usage, it implies signal interference, unpredictable activity disrupting monitored systems. Enlil interprets this escalation as a breach of tolerances. His response is procedural: reduce throughput, reset the system. The solution proposed is catastrophic but clean: a flood that wipes surface infrastructure and unregulated populations, allowing civilization to be reinstalled under tighter controls. The tablets do not describe anger. They describe consensus building, debate, and finally authorization. Enki dissents. His objection is not sentimental, it is strategic. Total reset risks loss of accumulated knowledge. The MI, the operational decrees that govern civilization, cannot be recreated from scratch without direct oversight. If humanity is erased entirely, the system collapses. Enki's solution is preservation of data, of templates, and of select human carriers capable of restarting operations. The flood narratives emerge from this conflict. They are not singular stories, but a cluster of technical briefings retold in later mythic language. In the Sumerian account of Ziusudra, preserved in fragmented tablets from Nippur, the warning is delivered covertly. Enki does not openly defy the council. He communicates through indirect means, speaking to a wall, a metaphor for encrypted transmission. The instructions are precise. Build a vessel to specific ratios, seal it with bitumen in layered applications, stock it not just with life, but with records. The vessel is not a boat in the conventional sense. It is a mobile archive. Descriptions emphasize compartmentalization, airflow, and stability. These are not details a storyteller invents casually. They reflect understanding of long-duration containment. Later Akkadian versions, such as the account of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, expand on this, describing navigational control, storm endurance, and post-event protocols. Archaeology supports the scale of the event. Excavations across southern Mesopotamia reveal a uniform flood layer dating to roughly 2900 BC. At Ur, Woolley uncovered a thick deposit of sterile clay separating earlier occupation from later Sumerian levels. Similar layers appear at Kish, Lagash, and Shuruppak. The extent suggests a regional catastrophe far exceeding seasonal flooding. Settlements were erased simultaneously. Yet not everything was lost. Certain sites show evidence of deliberate preparation. Sealed rooms containing tablets, tools, and ritual objects appear beneath later construction. These caches align with textual references to underground repositories designed to survive inundation. Knowledge was stored redundantly, physically, and biologically. The biological aspect is the most controversial. The tablets imply that certain humans were modified to serve as living archives. Memory techniques, extended lifespans, and enhanced cognition are described not as miracles, but as features. These individuals could carry vast amounts of information orally, reconstructing systems even if written records were destroyed. The Sumerian term used implies one who holds instructions, closer to a technician than a prophet. After the waters recede, civilization does not restart slowly. It snaps back. Urban planning reappears almost immediately. Irrigation grids are re-established. Metallurgy resumes without experimentation. This is visible in the archaeological record as a sudden resurgence of complexity. The gap is destruction, not regression. Parallel flood traditions across cultures reinforce the scope. The Atrahasis epic mirrors the Sumerian account with added detail on labor management among the Anunnaki. Egyptian texts refer to a primeval inundation before the First Dynasty, during a period called Zep Tepi, the first time when divine rulers governed directly. In the Indus Valley, early urban centers emerge with advanced drainage and standardized bricks shortly after the same time frame. Independent development struggle to explain synchronized recovery. The tablets insist the flood was not punishment, it was correction. Unauthorized genetic mixing had occurred. Certain watchers, operating outside protocol, had interacted too directly with human populations. Their offspring, described as hybrids of unusual size and capability, destabilized social systems. These beings appear in later traditions as giants, but the earliest texts frame them as incompatible products, powerful, intelligent, but unsustainable. The solution required both environmental reset and biological cleanup. Floodwaters eliminate surface populations. Hybrids are removed. Authorized human lines are preserved. Oversight resumes under stricter rules. The rebellious watchers are stripped of access and confined. Their punishment is not torment, but restriction, forced observation without intervention. This framework reframes later religious demonologies. Fallen beings are not evil by nature. They are decommissioned operators. Their knowledge persists, fragmented and distorted, reappearing as forbidden arts, occult practices, or dangerous technologies in later cultures. What was once regulated becomes taboo. Post-flood governance changes. Direct presence diminishes. Human rulers retain authority, but with reduced enhancement. Lifespans shorten. Memory degrades. Ritual replaces procedure as understanding fades. Temples become symbolic interfaces, attempting to replicate communication once achieved directly. Ziggurats emerge during this phase. These structures are not merely religious monuments, they are artificial mountains, communication platforms designed to bridge earth and sky. Their stepped design mirrors earlier sacred peaks declared off-limits. Orientation aligns with specific stars associated with Anu, Enlil, and Enki. Internal chambers are engineered for acoustic resonance, amplifying sound in controlled frequencies. This suggests attempts to re-establish contact using architecture as a technological substitute. The Anu Ziggurat at Uruk exemplifies this shift. Built around 3200 BC, it incorporates 7 levels corresponding to celestial divisions. Sound tests conducted in surviving chambers demonstrate amplification properties consistent with intentional acoustic engineering. The builders no longer fully understood the system they were imitating, but they preserved its form. Knowledge transmission continues through priesthoods. Training becomes secretive. Access is restricted. Mystery replaces maintenance. Babylonian temple schools preserve astronomical calculations, mathematical systems, and metallurgical formulas long after their origin is forgotten. Greek scholars later inherit this material, translating it without knowing its source. What began as operational oversight becomes mythology, then theology. Names change, roles blur, but the underlying pattern persists. Civilization rises abruptly, collapses catastrophically, and re-emerges guided by preserved knowledge. The flood marks the end of open management and the beginning of indirect control. From this point forward, humanity is expected to operate with limited guidance, using fragments of a system it did not design. The Watchers withdraw not because their work is finished, but because continued intervention risks repeating the failure. The tablets do not present this as an ending, they frame it as a transition. Civilization will continue, but without constant supervision. Whether humanity succeeds or fails from that point forward becomes an open variable, one that the Watchers are no longer authorized to correct. With direct oversight withdrawn, the burden of continuity shifted to institutions designed to imitate what had once been maintained effortlessly. The most resilient of these institutions were not palaces or armies, but schools embedded inside temples. These were not places of worship in the modern sense. They were repositories of numbers, cycles, materials, and procedures, guarded by specialists trained to preserve function through repetition when comprehension was no longer guaranteed. Babylonian temple archives reveal curricula that would be excessive for ritual alone. Students memorized astronomical periods spanning centuries, learned numerical systems based on 60 rather than 10, and copied tables of metal ratios whose applications were no longer fully explained. These exercises preserved results, even as causes faded. The base 60 system, awkward for daily counting, excelled at calculating angles, time divisions, and celestial motion. Its survival makes sense only if accuracy mattered more than convenience. Astronomy became the spine of this preservation effort. The sky was the one system still operating predictably. Stars did not forget. Planetary cycles repeated with mechanical consistency. By anchoring calendars, agriculture, and ritual timing to celestial motion, post-flood societies stabilized themselves around an external clock immune to political collapse. Tablets recording the movements of Venus over decades, such as those later compiled under the reign of Ammisaduqa, demonstrate observational continuity requiring generations of disciplined record-keeping. These records are not speculative. They predict retrograde motion, visibility cycles, and conjunctions with precision that rivals modern back calculation. Errors are minimal. This implies either uninterrupted observation across centuries or access to preserved datasets inherited from before the flood. The latter aligns with textual claims that astronomical knowledge was among the MI deliberately saved. Architecture reflects the same strategy. Post-flood cities adopt standardized layouts aligned to cardinal directions and stellar risings. Streets run true north-south. Temples face specific horizons. These alignments are not decorative. They function as calibration tools, embedding cosmic reference points into the built environment so that even if texts were lost, orientation remained. Egypt mirrors this pattern. Early dynastic monuments appear suddenly with precision stonework, axial alignment, and proportional systems that assume advanced geometry. The Great Pyramid's orientation deviates from true north by only a fraction of a degree, an accuracy difficult to achieve without sophisticated surveying methods. Egyptian texts attribute this knowledge to the Netjeru, beings who ruled during Zep-Tepi, a primordial era equivalent to the Sumerian pre-flood age. The Turin King list records reigns of divine rulers lasting thousands of years before human dynasties begin. Like the Sumerian king list, it reads administratively, not symbolically. These divine reigns establish institutions, calendars, and construction principles. When human kings take over, they inherit frameworks already optimized. Medical knowledge follows the same trajectory. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, though copied much later, preserves surgical techniques and anatomical observations inconsistent with trial-and-error folk medicine. Injuries are diagnosed systematically. Prognoses are categorized. Treatments are mechanical, not magical. The language suggests instruction rather than discovery. Metallurgy also resumes without hesitation. Early bronze alloys appear with consistent composition across regions, implying shared formulas. Smelting techniques show control over temperature and impurities. These are not accidental achievements. They require repeatable processes. Tablets listing metal ratios read like recipes stripped of explanation, preserving outcome while obscuring origin. As centuries pass, myth grows around what was once maintenance. Beings who had enforced procedures become gods who demand sacrifice. Devices become relics. Interfaces become altars. The tablets of destinies, once command instruments, survive only as legends granting authority to whoever holds them. Their theft by figures like Anzu transforms into moral allegory, but the original concern, unauthorized access to control systems, remains visible beneath the narrative. The memory of watchers persists most clearly in later Hebrew literature. The Book of Enoch describes beings who observe humanity, teach forbidden knowledge, and are punished by confinement. The parallels to Mesopotamian accounts of rebellious overseers are structural, not superficial. Domains of instruction, astronomy, metallurgy, medicine, match exactly. Punishment involves removal of access, not annihilation. Language preserves these connections. The Aramaic and Hebrew terms for watcher trace back to Akkadian roots, meaning to see or to observe. This is not coincidence. It is inheritance. Concepts traveled even when explanations did not. By the time these traditions are written down, their authors no longer distinguish between supervision and divinity. What had been managerial authority is reinterpreted as moral authority. Disobedience becomes sin. Protocol becomes commandment. The system adapts to human psychology, using reverence to enforce behaviors once ensured by direct oversight. Yet fragments of the original logic remain. Angels are assigned territories. Records are kept. Actions are weighed. This is surveillance language, not mythology. Even the idea of judgment echoes administrative review rather than ethical evaluation. The withdrawal of the Watchers does not end influence. It forces it underground. Knowledge is passed through mystery schools, initiations, and symbolic systems designed to conceal as much as they reveal. Access becomes selective. Power concentrates. Greek scholars encountering Babylonian archives during the Hellenistic period recognize the value, but not the origin. They translate tables, adopt geometries, and integrate astronomical models into new frameworks. Names change, credit shifts, continuity persists. By late antiquity, the story has fractured into religion, philosophy, and science. Each carries pieces of the same inheritance, unaware of the larger structure they once formed. What began as a managed system becomes a contested legacy. The tablets never claim the Watchers will return openly. They imply something subtler. Oversight continues through constraint rather than presence. Humanity is permitted autonomy within limits set long ago. Catastrophe remains an option, but no longer a preferred solution. Civilization, in this framework, is not a linear ascent. It is a probationary phase. Knowledge is loaned, withdrawn, and redistributed as conditions allow. The silence of the Watchers is not abandonment. It is a test. Whether humanity can maintain systems it did not invent, guided only by fragments, memory, and the sky. And in the clay, buried beneath cities rebuilt again and again, the instructions remain, waiting for eyes capable of seeing them not as myth, but as record. As human institutions matured under indirect oversight, a quieter form of intervention emerged, one that left fewer ruins and more lineages. The tablets shift focus from cities and systems to bloodlines and succession, suggesting that preservation did not rely on structures alone. Certain families, repeatedly associated with kingship, priesthood, and technical knowledge, appear across centuries and regions with unusual consistency. These were not merely noble houses. They functioned as biological continuities. The Sumerian king list records abrupt transitions where kingship descends from heaven after periods of disruption. The phrase does not indicate coronation. It implies reauthorization. When a line failed, through incompetence, rebellion, or extinction, authority was reassigned. The new ruler often appears with no recorded ancestry, ruling immediately with legitimacy and competence. This pattern challenges conventional inheritance models but aligns with selective installation. Texts describe early rulers as possessing capacities that later generations lacked. Lifespans measured in centuries gradually shrink. Cognitive acuity attributed to first kings fades into legend. These changes are not romanticized. They are recorded. The implication is decay, not embellishment. Biological enhancement was not self-sustaining. Creation narratives offered technical detail disguised as ritual. In the Atrahasis epic, The formation of humanity involves mixing clay with the blood of a slain divine being named Kingu. Blood, in ancient understanding, carried essence, identity, capability, authority. Kingu is described as possessing intelligence and leadership qualities. His blood is processed, divided, and combined with material from the earth to produce 14 beings, equally male and female. The specificity is striking. 14 is not symbolic here, it is procedural. Gestation is timed. Roles are defined. The resulting humans are capable of labor, reasoning, and obedience. They are not worshippers, they are workers. This account reframes creation not as miracle, but as engineering. Humans are designed to fill a labor gap after lower-tier overseers rebel. Efficiency replaces improvisation. Over time, unauthorized modifications occur. Certain watchers exceed protocol, introducing additional alterations. The offspring of these unions are described as giants, not merely in stature, but in capacity. They consume resources unsustainably. They disrupt planning. Their removal becomes necessary for system stability. The flood resolves this in bulk. Post-flood, genetic management becomes subtler. Instead of overt creation, selective breeding and enhancement of existing lines maintain desired traits. Royal families across Mesopotamia, Egypt, and later Israel claim divine descent. This is not metaphorical. It is a claim of origin, of having been shaped differently. Egyptian sources reinforce this. Pharaohs are called sons of Ra, not because they worship Ra, but because they embody continuity with a pre-dynastic ruling class. Early dynastic burials reveal physical traits distinct from common populations: cranial proportions, dental patterns, and bone density suggesting non-random selection. These differences diminish over time, consistent with dilution. The preservation of knowledge follows the same pattern. Certain families maintain priestly roles for centuries, controlling temple archives and educational access. These positions are hereditary. Entry is restricted. Outsiders are excluded not for purity, but for reliability. Knowledge survives where bloodlines do. The concept of covenant emerges from this framework. A covenant is not a moral agreement. It is a contract defining terms of access, protection, and obligation. When Hebrew texts describe covenants between divine entities and specific families, the language mirrors administrative agreements. Promises are conditional. Breaches have consequences. Benefits include longevity, land, and protection. The figure of Noah exemplifies this selection. He is described as perfect in his generations, a phrase often interpreted ethically. In its original context, it refers to lineage integrity. Noah's genetic line remains uncontaminated by unauthorized modification. This makes him suitable for preservation. He becomes a carrier not only of life, but of instruction. After the flood, similar selection continues. Figures like Abraham appear abruptly with favor, protection, and promise. His descendants are set apart, guided, corrected, and occasionally punished, but never abandoned. The narrative emphasizes obedience, but beneath it lies compatibility. Certain lines are suited to interface with residual systems of control. The idea of chosen people emerges not as favoritism, but as functionality. Selection is based on capacity to maintain instruction under constraint. When these groups deviate too far, intervention occurs: exile, collapse, or correction, followed by reinstallation. This pattern repeats globally. In Mesoamerica, divine kings claim descent from sky beings. In China, early emperors rule by mandate of heaven, losing it when governance fails. The language differs, but the structure remains. Authority is conditional and revocable. Over time, genetic intervention fades entirely. Humanity becomes fully autonomous. What remains is mythologized memory. Divine ancestry becomes symbolic. Bloodlines persist, but without enhancement. The system relies increasingly on culture rather than biology. Yet echoes remain. The obsession with lineage in ancient texts, the meticulous genealogies, the emphasis on purity and inheritance all point to a time when these factors were operationally significant. They mattered because they worked. Modern genetics complicates this picture. Studies of ancient remains reveal migration patterns and admixture events inconsistent with slow diffusion. Certain elite burials show genetic markers uncommon in surrounding populations. These markers spread, then disappear. The pattern suggests introduction followed by assimilation. The Watchers, in this light, were not only engineers of cities and systems, but of continuity itself. They understood that structures fall, knowledge degrades. But blood remembers longer than stone. The ethical implications are uncomfortable. Humanity was shaped, not evolved alone. Autonomy was delayed, progress was managed. But the tablets do not apologize. They do not justify. They record. By the late Bronze Age, direct references to genetic shaping vanish. The system has moved on. Humans are on their own. The Watchers observe, but no longer adjust. The experiment has entered its final phase. Civilization continues, rising and falling, guided by fragments of an ancient blueprint encoded in culture, language, and lineage. Whether humanity was meant to outgrow this system or remain bound by it is never stated. The tablets end their account without resolution. They do not predict triumph or failure. They simply stop. Oversight recedes into silence, leaving behind a species capable of remembering just enough to wonder why it feels watched, chosen, or abandoned, depending on where it stands in the long inheritance of a design it did not author. As generations passed and biological intervention receded, control shifted almost entirely to symbols. What had once been enforced through presence and capability was now maintained through narrative, ritual, and fear of consequence. The Watchers no longer corrected errors directly. Instead, they embedded control mechanisms into belief systems that could self-replicate long after the original operators were gone. Law codes are the clearest example. The earliest legal texts, such as those attributed to Ur-Nammu and later Hammurabi, do not present law as human invention. They insist the rules were received. Authority flows downward. The king does not legislate. He transmits. His legitimacy rests on fidelity to a higher order he did not design. Punishments are severe not because of cruelty, but because deviation threatens systemic stability. These laws regulate behavior critical to infrastructure, water use, land boundaries, labor obligations, and debt. Moral language appears, but it is secondary. The core concern is predictability. A society that behaves predictably can be managed indirectly, one that does not becomes chaotic. Religion absorbs this function seamlessly. Temples become regulatory centers. Offerings are standardized. Calendars dictate labor and rest. Festivals synchronize populations across regions, aligning human activity with astronomical cycles that remain reliable reference points. When people move together, they are easier to forecast. Priesthoods evolve into data custodians. They track time, harvests, births, and deaths. They interpret signs not as omens, but as indicators. Divination, in its earliest form, is pattern recognition applied to incomplete information. Liver omens, star charts, and dream interpretation are all attempts to model complex systems using symbolic inputs. Over time, the symbolic layer thickens. What was once a practical method becomes sacred mystery. Accuracy matters less than authority. As long as people believe outcomes depend on compliance, behavior remains constrained. The memory of the Watchers persists within this framework as angels, gods, or spirits. Their surveillance role is preserved intact. They see all. They record all. Judgment follows. This is not theology. It is deterrence. The concept of omniscience emerges not from philosophical speculation, but from inherited oversight. When earlier humans knew they were observed, behavior adjusted accordingly. When observation became symbolic, belief took its place. Texts describing heavenly books, tablets, or records echo the tablets of destinies. The idea that actions are written, weighed, and reviewed mirrors administrative review processes. Even the language of judgment borrows from accounting. Debts, balances, reckoning. As empires rise, these systems scale. Assyria, Babylon, Persia, each adopts divine sanction as the basis of governance. Kings are chosen, guided, and removed by higher powers. Rebellion is not merely political, it is cosmic disorder. Yet cracks appear. As literacy spreads, interpretation multiplies. Symbols detach from original function. Philosophers begin to question. The Greeks inherit astronomical and mathematical knowledge stripped of its supervisory context. They ask how, not who. Cause replaces command. This shift marks a critical transition. Knowledge becomes explanatory rather than authoritative. The universe is no longer administered. It is governed by principles. This threatens the old control model. Without belief in oversight, behavior becomes harder to predict. In response, religious systems intensify moralization. Sin replaces error. Guilt replaces non-compliance. Internal surveillance replaces external. The Watchers no longer need to see if humans watch themselves. This psychological adaptation proves durable. Even as gods retreat, conscience remains. The system has evolved. Meanwhile, fragments of older knowledge resurface unpredictably. Alchemists rediscover metallurgical ratios without understanding their origin. Architects replicate proportions that feel correct without knowing why. Mathematicians stumble upon constants encoded millennia earlier in stone. These rediscoveries spark revolutions. Each time, humanity edges closer to reconstructing systems once managed for it. Each time, catastrophe follows close behind. Power outpaces restraint. The pattern repeats in cycles: advancement, overreach, collapse. The ancient tablets anticipated this. They describe humanity as capable but unstable. Oversight was a scaffold, not a crutch. Removal was inevitable. By the time Rome rises, the Watchers are memory layered beneath memory. Angels replace administrators. Demons replace rogue operators. Heaven becomes moral theater rather than control center. Yet the architecture of oversight persists invisibly. Borders align to ancient divisions. Capitals sit atop older sacred sites. Roads follow paths laid out long before. Even language carries residue. Words for law, order, and fate trace back to administrative roots. Civilization speaks in the grammar of management. The question is no longer whether humanity was guided, but whether it still is. Modern surveillance states, data collection, predictive modeling echo ancient oversight eerily well. Humans have recreated, in crude form, the systems once imposed upon them. The difference is intent. The Watchers managed for stability. Humans manage for power. Whether this divergence was anticipated remains unclear. The tablets fall silent before answering. They record installation, correction, withdrawal. They do not record outcome. Perhaps the final test was always autonomy. Whether a species shaped by guidance could govern itself without becoming what it once feared. The symbols remain. The sky still turns. The records still exist, buried, copied, mistranslated, waiting, not for belief, but for recognition. As symbolic control solidified, another layer of the ancient system began to surface through geometry. Numbers, shapes, and proportions survived where stories fractured. Unlike myth, mathematics does not drift easily. It either works or it fails. Across post-flood civilizations, the same ratios reappear in places that should have no contact, embedded in monuments, city grids, and ritual objects, as if they were instructions carved into reality itself. The most persistent of these is proportion. Early builders did not rely on arbitrary dimensions. Structures followed repeatable relationships between height, base, and angle. These relationships optimized stability, acoustics, and visual dominance. In Mesopotamia, ziggurats rise in stepped tiers that follow consistent ratios, each level shrinking by a predictable fraction. This creates not only structural balance, but controlled resonance, allowing sound to travel upward in focused channels. In Egypt, the same mathematical discipline governs pyramid construction. The slope of the Great Pyramid encodes a ratio that approximates the relationship between a circle's circumference and its diameter. Whether intentional or inherited, the result is undeniable. Builders who lacked symbolic notation for such constants nonetheless reproduced them physically. Geometry preserved what language could not. These proportions are not decorative. They regulate stress distribution, minimize material fatigue, and create predictable vibrational behavior. Modern engineers recognize these outcomes immediately. Ancient builders achieved them without recorded trial and error phases. The knowledge appears applied, not discovered. City planning follows similar rules. Early urban centers in Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley use standardized brick sizes, orthogonal layouts, and drainage systems calculated to maintain flow velocity. Water moves neither too fast nor too slow. These are not intuitive solutions. They require modeling. Astronomy anchors these designs. Structures align with solstices, equinoxes, and heliacal risings of key stars. Alignment errors are minimal, suggesting long-term observation or inherited data. A single generation cannot map celestial cycles spanning decades. Someone preserved the numbers. The sky functions as the last unaltered reference system. Empires collapse. Floods erase records. Stars persist. By locking architecture to the heavens, the ancient system ensured recalibration was always possible. Even if writing vanished, orientation remained. Sound is another overlooked component. Certain chambers amplify low frequencies while dampening others. This is not accidental. Low-frequency sound travels farther and penetrates matter more effectively. In enclosed spaces, it induces physical sensations, pressure, unease, focus. These effects are well documented today. Ancient builders exploited them deliberately. Temple chambers in Mesopotamia and Egypt share this acoustic signature. Chanting within them produces standing waves that reinforce specific tones. This is not mystical. It is physics. Such environments alter perception, enhancing authority and emotional impact. Communication conducted here would feel overwhelming, reinforcing hierarchy without force. Light behaves similarly. Narrow shafts direct sunlight to specific points on particular days. At certain moments, entire interiors ignite briefly, then fade. These events mark time precisely, signaling transitions in agricultural or administrative cycles. The building becomes a clock. This convergence of math, sound, light, and orientation suggests integrated design. These are not isolated innovations. They are components of a system intended to regulate human behavior subtly but effectively. Over time, the meaning shifts. Later generations inherit the structures, but not the rationale. The experience remains, stripped of explanation. Awe replaces understanding. Ritual replaces operation. The builders of later eras imitate form without function. Proportions degrade. Alignments drift. Acoustic precision is lost. What remains is grandeur without control. Yet the original blueprint persists enough to influence even modern design. Government buildings echo temple layouts. Cathedrals adopt nave proportions that induce reverence. Concert halls rediscover acoustic principles used thousands of years earlier. Humanity circles back to solutions once handed to it fully formed. The tablets never state explicitly why geometry was favored, but the implication is clear. Numbers do not rebel. They cannot misinterpret instruction. Geometry enforces order without argument. In this sense, mathematics becomes the last watcher, silent, impartial, ever-present. Even as belief systems fracture, geometry remains convincing. A bridge either stands or collapses. A calendar either predicts or fails. The ancient system embedded itself into this inevitability. The danger of this inheritance lies in misuse. Geometry grants power without ethics. When applied without restraint, it magnifies intent. Ancient oversight balanced capability with limitation. Modern application often does not. Weapons, surveillance networks, and mass infrastructure rely on the same principles once used to stabilize early civilization. The difference is scale and intent. What was once centralized and constrained is now distributed and competitive. The ancient builders anticipated this risk. Many structures include deliberate inefficiencies, limits built into scale, access, or replication. Knowledge was compartmentalized. No single group held everything. This prevented runaway dominance. Modern systems lack such breaks. Knowledge spreads instantly. Power concentrates rapidly. Collapse accelerates. Seen this way, the ancient monuments are warnings as much as achievements. They demonstrate what controlled knowledge can build, and what uncontrolled knowledge can destroy. The watchers are absent, but their design philosophy remains embedded in stone and number. Whether humanity learns to read it correctly determines what comes next. The geometry does not judge, it only responds. And it has been responding, patiently, since before history learned how to count. When geometry preserved structure and ritual preserved behavior, language became the final carrier of control. Words outlived cities. Sounds survived stone. Long after the watchers withdrew, their influence continued to propagate through syntax, metaphor, and naming, compressed into stories simple enough to repeat, yet precise enough to constrain meaning. The earliest written languages do not grow organically. They appear abruptly, fully capable of abstraction. Sumerian cuneiform begins as accounting marks, but rapidly expands into grammar, tense, and complex reference. Egyptian hieroglyphs combine phonetics, symbolism, and determinatives from their earliest phases. There is no stuttering infancy. Writing arrives operational. This matters because writing is more than communication. It is memory externalized. Once knowledge leaves the body and enters a medium, it becomes transferable, enforceable, and scalable. Control no longer requires presence. Instruction survives absence. The Watchers understood this. The earliest texts emphasize correct copying over creativity. Scribes are trained to reproduce exactly, not to innovate. Errors are punished severely. Accuracy is sacred because distortion accumulates. Lists dominate early tablets. Lists of kings, stars, offerings, boundaries. Lists reduce complexity to order. They allow verification. A list can be audited. Myth cannot. Even narratives are structured like reports. Events are sequenced. Causes are noted. Outcomes are recorded. Emotional language is minimal. The tone is procedural. Later cultures misread this restraint as primitive simplicity. It is anything but. Names themselves carry instruction. Deities are named by function. Enlil is not just a character. His name encodes authority over atmosphere. Enki's name embeds earth and mastery. These are job titles fossilized into identity. As languages evolve, the functional clarity blurs, but echoes remain. Words for law, order, fate, and decree across Indo-European and Semitic languages trace back to roots associated with setting, fixing, or placing. Administrative actions, not moral ones. The concept of the word as a creative force emerges from this context. In later theology, speech creates reality. In the original framework, command initiates process. The universe responds to instruction because it was designed to. This is why blasphemy is treated as a crime in ancient law codes. Misuse of words threatens system integrity. If language is an interface, corrupted input produces unpredictable output. Over time, control through language becomes indirect. Parables replace protocols. Proverbs replace procedures. Meaning becomes layered, allowing interpretation without exposing underlying mechanics. This protects knowledge while maintaining influence. Sacred texts encode this duality. On the surface, they teach morality. Beneath, they preserve structure. Calendars, genealogies, and ritual instructions anchor behavior to predictable cycles. Even when belief wanes, habit persists. Translation accelerates distortion, but also spread. As texts move between cultures, metaphors adapt while frameworks endure. A watcher becomes an angel. An administrator becomes a messenger. Authority remains external. Alphabetic writing intensifies this shift. It detaches sound from symbol, increasing accessibility but reducing precision. Oral tradition compensates through repetition and rhythm, preserving core structures even as details mutate. By the Iron Age, language has become the primary tool of governance. Empires issue edicts. Laws are proclaimed. Oaths bind populations. The divine sanction lingers, but enforcement is human. Yet the architecture of command remains visible. Decrees begin with authority claims. Thus says echoes ancient transmission language. The speaker is a channel, not an originator. The watcher's absence necessitates redundancy. Multiple texts repeat the same rules. Variations are tolerated only within limits. Canonization emerges as a defense mechanism against drift. When divergence exceeds tolerance, schism occurs. Competing interpretations fracture authority. Control weakens. Conflict follows. This pattern repeats across civilizations. Unified language underwrites stability. Fragmentation precedes collapse. Even today, political power depends on narrative control. Constitutions, declarations, and laws function as modern tablets of destinies, documents that define reality within their jurisdiction. Their power lies not in paper, but in collective agreement to obey encoded instruction. The ancient system anticipated this. It embedded obedience into meaning itself. To speak correctly was to align with order. To deviate was to invite chaos. The psychological impact is profound. Humans internalize authority through language. Self-talk becomes regulation. Conscience speaks in inherited words. This internalization completes the transition from external oversight to self-governance. The Watchers no longer need to observe if humans observe themselves. Yet something is lost. Language can preserve instruction, but not comprehension. Over time, rules remain while reasons vanish. Compliance persists, but adaptability declines. When environments change faster than language updates, systems fail. This is the risk the Watchers once managed directly. Without them, humanity relies on interpretation, often too slow or too rigid. The tablets record this risk but offer no remedy. They assume oversight will not return. Adaptation must come from within. Language continues to evolve, shedding old constraints, inventing new ones. Some ancient structures dissolve. Others resurface unexpectedly, embedded in modern ideologies, legal frameworks, and technological metaphors. Code replaces scripture. Algorithms replace edicts. Yet the logic is familiar. Input, process, output. Obedience to structure yields predictable results. The Watcher's greatest legacy may be this conceptual inheritance, the idea that reality can be shaped through instruction, that order can be imposed through design, and that control need not be visible to be effective. Language remains the quietest, most enduring instrument of that design. It speaks even when the architects are gone. As language stabilized authority and geometry enforced order, memory itself became the next battleground. The ancient system did not rely solely on structures, bloodlines, or words. It depended on continuity, on the ability of knowledge to survive rupture. When floods, invasions, and collapses erased institutions, memory had to carry what stone and text could not. Early cultures treated memory as a trained discipline, not a passive faculty. Sumerian and later Babylonian texts describe specialists whose role was to hold instruction. These were not storytellers. They were repositories. Long lists of stars, omens, measures, and procedures were memorized verbatim. Variation was forbidden. Forgetting was failure. This practice appears again in Egypt, where priestly castes preserved astronomical and ritual knowledge through oral transmission even when written records existed. Writing was a backup. Memory was primary. A living archive could move, adapt, and survive catastrophe. The emphasis on repetition over innovation was deliberate. Memory resists reinterpretation when reinforced constantly. The ancient system valued fidelity above creativity. New ideas destabilized inherited models. Stability required sameness. This explains the hostility toward novelty embedded in many early traditions. Innovation is framed as transgression. Forbidden knowledge is not dangerous because it is false, but because it is unregulated. Unauthorized understanding breaks containment. Myth becomes a mnemonic device. Stories compress complex systems into narrative sequences that are easy to remember and difficult to alter. Characters stand in for functions. Events encode processes. Floods represent resets. Ascents represent authorization. Dissents represent intervention. Even when meaning fades, structure persists. A story retold inaccurately still carries echoes of its original logic. This makes myth an ideal vessel for long-term preservation. The Watchers understood this constraint. They did not expect humans to maintain full comprehension indefinitely. They designed redundancy. What could not survive in text would survive in ritual. What could not survive in ritual would survive in story. What could not survive in story would survive in instinct. Fear, awe, obedience, these emotional responses anchor memory deeper than facts. A society that fears divine judgment remembers rules even when it forgets reasons. This is not manipulation. It is engineering. Over centuries, memory fragments, pieces of the system surface unpredictably. An old proportion reappears in architecture. A forgotten star cycle resurfaces in a calendar. A medical technique emerges without lineage. These are not rediscoveries in the pure sense. They are recollections triggered by context. This phenomenon gives rise to the idea of revelation. Knowledge seems to arrive suddenly, unearned, complete. Individuals are credited with divine insight. In reality, they access fragments preserved in culture, activated by need. Prophets, sages, and visionaries occupy this role. They are not originators. They are interfaces. Their authority rests on alignment with inherited patterns. When alignment fails, their influence collapses. The system tolerates this fluctuation. It does not require perfect continuity. It only requires that enough survives to allow reconstruction after collapse. Humanity is expected to lose and recover knowledge cyclically. This expectation reframes history. Progress is not linear. It oscillates. Peaks are followed by valleys. Each recovery draws closer to the original blueprint, though never fully restoring it. The Watchers' withdrawal made this process slower but more resilient. Direct oversight created dependency. Indirect preservation fosters adaptation. Humanity learns not because it is guided, but because it must. Memory also shapes identity. Genealogies dominate ancient texts not for vanity, but for orientation. Knowing who came before establishes continuity. Breaking lineage breaks instruction flow. This is why exiles are devastating. They sever memory chains. Rebuilding requires re-anchoring identity through ritual, law, and narrative. The return is never complete, but sufficient. Modern psychology echoes this ancient understanding. Trauma imprints memory more deeply than routine. Catastrophe becomes a teaching tool. The flood teaches limits. Collapse teaches restraint. Survival teaches selection. The ethical cost is immense. Entire populations suffer to preserve a framework they do not understand. The tablets record this without apology. They do not weigh suffering. They measure outcome. As millennia pass, humanity internalizes the system. Memory shifts from collective to individual. Education replaces initiation. Archives replace elders. Efficiency increases. Depth declines. Yet the ancient scaffolding remains visible. Academic disciplines mirror priesthoods. Peer review mirrors adjudication. Credentials mirror authorization. Knowledge is still gated, certified, and transmitted hierarchically. The Watcher's design persists, stripped of its origin story. Humans enforce it on themselves. The danger arises when memory outpaces wisdom. Technology accelerates recall without comprehension. Data accumulates faster than meaning. The system strains. Ancient collapses were local. Modern collapse would be global. The tablets hint at this risk obliquely. They describe a final phase where correction is no longer possible without annihilation. Whether humanity has entered that phase is unclear. The records do not extend that far. They stop when oversight ends. What remains is memory, partial, distorted, but persistent. It whispers through language, structure, and instinct. It urges order, warns against excess, and reminds humanity that it was once managed for a reason. The Watchers may be gone, but their greatest safeguard remains intact. As long as memory survives catastrophe, civilization can restart. The question is not whether humanity will remember. It is what it will choose to forget. As memory carried fragments forward, power began to migrate. What had once been centralized under oversight dispersed into competing human hands. The ancient system assumed fragmentation as an acceptable risk, but it did not anticipate acceleration. When authority is divided without coordination, imitation replaces comprehension, and control becomes coercion rather than alignment. The earliest empires reveal this shift clearly. Authority is no longer derived from access to knowledge, but from the ability to enforce compliance. Kings still claim divine mandate, but the mandate is increasingly rhetorical. Where earlier rulers acted as intermediaries executing inherited systems, later rulers act as owners. The difference is subtle but catastrophic. Administrative texts from Assyria reflect this change. Records emphasize tribute, extraction, and punishment over balance. Infrastructure exists, but it serves expansion rather than stability. The sky is still consulted, but often after decisions are made, not before. Omen interpretation becomes justification rather than guidance. This marks the inversion of the original framework. Instead of adapting behavior to preserve system equilibrium, systems are bent to justify behavior. The Watcher's logic is still referenced, but its function is hollowed out. War accelerates this decay. Conquest disrupts memory chains, libraries burn, priests scatter, knowledge fragments further. Each empire inherits partial systems it cannot fully maintain. Complexity becomes brittle. The Babylonian exile illustrates this sharply. When elite populations are displaced, their knowledge survives only if it can be internalized quickly. Written records become lifelines, codification intensifies, oral nuance is lost, law hardens, yet exile also forces synthesis. Hebrew scribes absorb Mesopotamian cosmology, administration, and symbolism, translating them into a new moral framework. Watchers become angels, councils become heavens, oversight becomes covenant. This moralization is adaptive. Without direct access to technical systems, ethical constraint becomes the primary regulator. Obedience is no longer about maintaining infrastructure, but about maintaining identity. Meanwhile, in Greece, a different adaptation occurs. Knowledge is abstracted. Mathematics and philosophy strip away divine authority and seek principle. This produces extraordinary insight, but removes restraint. Power becomes conceptual, not administrative. Plato's forms echo ancient blueprints without their context. Aristotle's categories mirror administrative sorting without enforcement mechanisms. Reason replaces command. This intellectual liberation accelerates discovery. It also accelerates divergence. Without shared authority, consensus fractures. Competing models proliferate. Rome responds by standardizing force. Law becomes universal, enforced by military reach. Order is imposed externally. This works temporarily. But without internal alignment, collapse is inevitable. Throughout these cycles, remnants of the original system persist stubbornly. Calendars remain astronomical. Architecture retains ancient proportions. Legal language echoes divine decree. These are not aesthetic choices. They are defaults inherited when alternatives fail. As Christianity spreads, it absorbs and simplifies. The Watcher's hierarchy collapses into a single omnipotent authority. Complexity is reduced to maintain coherence across vast populations. Salvation replaces optimization. This simplification preserves obedience but sacrifices nuance. The system survives by narrowing scope. What cannot be explained is declared mystery. What cannot be managed is deferred to the afterlife. Islam later restores administrative clarity. Angels regain defined roles. Law becomes procedural again. Timekeeping, astronomy, and architecture reassert precision. The ancient balance flickers back briefly. But fragmentation continues. Political authority and religious authority diverge. Knowledge accelerates. Printing externalizes memory completely. Oral continuity dies. The Industrial Revolution completes the inversion. Humans now command forces once attributed to gods: energy, motion, communication. The Watcher's former tools are recreated without their constraints. Electricity replaces lightning. Satellites replace Watchers. Data replaces prophecy. Surveillance becomes human. The ancient system warned against this asymmetry. Capability without oversight leads to instability. Power outpaces wisdom. Correction becomes difficult. Modern civilization reflects this risk. Global systems are interconnected but not harmonized. Failure cascades. Small errors propagate widely. Recovery becomes complex. The ancient collapses were local resets. Modern collapse would be systemic. Yet the inheritance also enables resilience. Distributed knowledge allows rapid rebuilding. Memory is no longer bound to place. Catastrophe destroys less absolutely. The question becomes scale. At what point does acceleration exceed recovery capacity? The tablets do not answer. They imply a threshold exists but do not define it. Oversight ends before this phase. Humanity is left with tools and fragments, charged with self-regulation. The Watcher's silence is not abandonment. It is abdication. Responsibility transfers fully. The system no longer corrects externally. Feedback must come from consequence. This is the final inheritance. Civilization must learn restraint not because it is commanded, but because it understands. Whether it can is the unresolved variable encoded into every surviving fragment. The ancient designers assumed cycles. They did not assume infinity. Power without alignment burns itself out. Memory remains, but memory alone is not enough. The next correction, if it comes, will not be managed from above. It will emerge from within. Or not at all. As human power accelerated beyond ancient thresholds, the last remaining constraint was time. Earlier systems limited expansion through cycles, seasons, celestial returns, generational turnover. These rhythms slowed decision-making and forced reflection. With the erosion of those constraints, time itself became compressible. Speed replaced patience. Reaction replaced deliberation. The ancient system treated time as a regulating force. Calendars were not conveniences. They were governors. Agricultural cycles dictated labor. Ritual calendars enforced pauses. Even kings were bound to celestial timing. Actions taken out of sequence were considered dangerous, not immoral. They disrupted synchronization. Astronomy ensured compliance. The sky could not be rushed. A solstice arrives when it arrives. A planet completes its cycle regardless of human urgency. By tying governance to celestial timing, early civilizations embedded delay into authority. Decisions waited for signs. Campaigns waited for seasons. Expansion was throttled. As reliance on the sky diminished, time became negotiable. Mechanical clocks abstracted duration from nature. Hours became uniform, interchangeable, and exploitable. The industrial age weaponized this abstraction. Productivity became the measure of value. Output replaced balance. This shift severed one of the last remaining safeguards of the Watcher's design. Systems began operating continuously, without pause. Feedback lag increased. Errors accumulated unnoticed until failure cascaded. Ancient collapses unfolded slowly enough to be recognized. Modern failures occur at speeds that overwhelm perception. By the time consequences appear, causes are buried beneath layers of acceleration. The tablets warned indirectly against this. References to appointed times and fixed seasons appear repeatedly. These are not ceremonial phrases. They denote synchronization points, moments when action aligns safely with system capacity. Acting outside them risks destabilization. In mythologized form, this becomes fate. In technical terms, it is load management. Modern civilization ignores load. Energy extraction, information flow, and economic growth are optimized for speed, not resilience. Redundancy is sacrificed for efficiency. Slack is eliminated. The Watcher's withdrawal assumed gradual progression. They did not account for exponential acceleration driven by feedback loops, technology improving technology, systems optimizing themselves beyond human comprehension. This creates a new asymmetry. Humans now operate systems whose behavior they cannot predict. Artificial intelligence, global finance, and climate feedbacks exhibit emergent properties. Control becomes probabilistic. Ancient oversight relied on bounded complexity. Systems were powerful but limited. Modern systems are unbounded. Time compression exacerbates this. Decisions propagate globally in seconds. Mistakes replicate instantly. Correction lags. The psychological impact mirrors earlier transitions. Anxiety replaces awe. Urgency replaces ritual. Attention fragments. Memory shortens. Long-term consequence loses salience. The ancient system countered this through enforced remembrance. Festivals, recitations, monuments. Modern culture celebrates novelty. Forgetting accelerates. This creates a paradox. Humanity possesses more recorded memory than ever before, yet accesses less of it meaningfully. Data overwhelms context. Signal drowns insight. The Watcher's design favored slow accumulation and careful transmission. Modern civilization favors rapid deployment and post hoc justification. The inversion is complete. Some structures still resist acceleration. Legal systems struggle to keep pace. Ethical frameworks lag behind technology. Biology enforces limits despite denial. These friction points produce crisis. The question is whether humanity can reintroduce constraint voluntarily. Ancient systems imposed limits externally. Modern limits must be chosen. History offers few examples of voluntary deceleration. Collapse has been the primary regulator. The tablets imply collapse was acceptable when controlled. Floods reset without annihilating memory. Modern collapse risks erasing digital continuity entirely. Data without power is silence. Yet the same acceleration that threatens collapse also enables unprecedented coordination. Humanity could synchronize intentionally, aligning action with planetary limits rather than exploiting them. The sky is still there. The cycles remain. What has changed is attention. The Watchers' final legacy may be this unresolved tension. They transferred capability faster than wisdom, then withdrew before equilibrium was restored. Whether this was miscalculation or necessity is unknown. Their records end before acceleration. They do not describe machines, networks, or abstraction at this scale. They assume feedback remains visible. Humanity now operates beyond that assumption. Time has become the new watcher, silent, unforgiving, impossible to negotiate with. It records without judgment. It responds only to physics. Delay accumulates debt. Acceleration compounds risk. The ancient monuments stand as reminders of patience embedded in stone. They took generations to build. They enforced continuity through slowness. Modern systems are built to be replaced before they are understood. This is not progress. It is exposure. The future hinges on whether humanity can rediscover temporal discipline, not through worship or fear, but through comprehension. Constraint must become strategic rather than imposed. The Watchers will not return to throttle speed or correct excess. Their silence confirms transfer of responsibility. Time no longer waits. It only responds. And it responds to alignment or to collapse with equal indifference. As temporal discipline eroded, another boundary dissolved almost unnoticed: scale. The ancient system assumed limits on how far influence could extend before weakening. Authority diminished with distance. Knowledge decayed as it traveled. This natural attenuation acted as a brake. No single failure could propagate everywhere at once. Modern civilization eliminated that attenuation. Scale expanded faster than structure. Decisions made in one place now reverberate globally. A localized error no longer remains local. The system has become tightly coupled, a term engineers use to describe networks where components depend on each other so closely that failure in one cascades immediately into others. The ancient records hint at awareness of this danger. Administrative divisions were territorial. Jurisdiction was segmented. Even the Watchers operated within domains. Anu, Enlil, and Enki did not overlap freely. Boundaries prevented interference and limited damage when something failed. This principle persists faintly in later human governance, provinces, states, nations, but technological integration has quietly overridden it. Borders no longer contain consequences. Markets, climate, and information flow ignore jurisdiction. The result is fragility disguised as strength. Systems appear powerful because they are vast, yet they are vulnerable because they are synchronized. A shock no longer dissipates. It amplifies. Ancient builders countered this through modularity. Cities functioned semi-independently. Knowledge was duplicated redundantly. If one archive burned, another survived elsewhere. Communication was slow enough to allow isolation. Modern redundancy is superficial. Data is centralized. Infrastructure is optimized globally. Efficiency replaces resilience. The same software controls millions of devices. The same supply chains feed continents. The Watchers' design avoided single points of failure. Humanity has embraced them. This shift reframes apocalypse narratives. Ancient catastrophes were regional resets. Floods destroyed plains, not planets. Survivors migrated. Memory reassembled. Civilization restarted. A global system lacks this luxury. There is nowhere external to migrate. No untouched archive. No unaffected population to seed recovery. The ancient texts never describe planetary annihilation. They assume continuity somewhere. This assumption no longer holds. Scale also distorts responsibility. When cause and effect are separated by distance and abstraction, accountability dissolves. Actions feel inconsequential. Harm becomes statistical. The Watchers' oversight relied on visibility. They saw directly. Humans now act through layers of mediation, algorithms, institutions, automation. No one sees the whole. This blindness is unprecedented. Ancient priests, kings, and administrators at least understood the systems they governed. Modern leaders often do not. Control is delegated to models few comprehend. This creates a governance vacuum. Decisions are made because they are possible, not because they are understood. The ancient system treated possibility as irrelevant. Only alignment mattered. Capability without alignment was restricted. Modern civilization celebrates capability. Alignment is optional. This inversion accelerates risk. Systems grow until they break, not until they stabilize. Collapse is treated as failure rather than correction. The tablets framed collapse as maintenance. Resetting prevented worse outcomes. Humanity now fears reset more than ruin. Scale also alters perception of time. Global consequences unfold slowly, diffused across populations. No single event triggers alarm. Thresholds are crossed quietly. Climate change exemplifies this. The ancient system embedded climate into governance. Agriculture, ritual, and settlement patterns adapted to cycles. Modern systems override cycles until they rebel. The Watchers' withdrawal assumed humanity would maintain sensitivity to limits. Instead, limits were abstracted away. Even language reflects this shift. Words like sustainable, resilient, and adaptive are invoked without structural change. Symbols persist without function. The ancient warning encoded in myth becomes clear here. Giants fall not because they are evil, but because they exceed scale they can control. Towers collapse not because building is wrong, but because height exceeds foundation. These are not moral lessons, they are engineering ones. The question confronting humanity is not whether it can operate at planetary scale. It already does. The question is whether it can reintroduce segmentation, delay, and redundancy at that scale. The Watchers' system achieved stability through separation. Modern systems pursue integration. Reintegration of limits requires conscious design. It demands accepting inefficiency, local variation, and delayed gratification. These run counter to prevailing incentives. Ancient civilizations enforced such constraints through authority. Modern societies must negotiate them democratically or technologically. Neither is proven at this scale. The tablets do not offer a solution. They record a design philosophy, not a prescription. They assume oversight is present. Without it, humanity must innovate constraint. This may be the final inheritance, not knowledge of how to build, but knowledge of how not to overbuild. Civilization has mastered expansion. It has not mastered restraint. The Watcher's silence at this stage feels intentional. Intervention now would invalidate the experiment. Humanity must confront scale with understanding or collapse under its own reach. There will be no flood this time to clear the board. No external reset. Only internal correction or systemic failure. The ancient system ensured survival by limiting exposure. Modern civilization maximizes it. Whether this divergence marks evolution or extinction remains unresolved. The records end where responsibility becomes absolute. Beyond that point, no watcher observes, no tablet records, no reset is authorized. Only consequence remains, distributed evenly across a system too large to blame and too connected to escape. Scale has become the final test. And it is one the ancient designers never had to answer for us. With scale now global and time compressed beyond recovery windows, the final variable under strain is meaning. The ancient system depended not only on structure, memory, and constraint, but on coherence. The alignment between what people believed, what they did, and what the system could sustain. When coherence fractures, collapse accelerates not because systems fail mechanically, but because participation erodes. Early civilizations did not separate meaning from function. Rituals synchronized labor. Myths encoded limits. Symbols reinforced behavior required for survival. Even when explanations were incomplete, participation maintained coherence. People acted in ways that preserved the system because meaning made those actions intelligible. Modern civilization severed that link. Function remains, but meaning fragments. Individuals participate in systems they do not understand and no longer believe in. Work feels abstract. Consequences feel distant. Purpose dissolves into metrics. The ancient records anticipate this risk indirectly. They emphasize unity of order, cosmic, social, and individual. When these orders diverge, instability follows. Disorder begins not with rebellion, but with disengagement. Disengagement is subtle. It looks like apathy, irony, or nihilism. When meaning collapses, compliance persists briefly, then decays. Systems continue operating until participation falls below viability. The Watcher's oversight once prevented this by ensuring alignment. Humans understood their role within a larger structure, even if they did not grasp its full scope. Modern individuals often feel replaceable, disconnected, and irrelevant to outcomes. This psychological dislocation is unprecedented. Ancient peasants understood seasonal dependence. Modern citizens interact with abstractions, markets, algorithms, institutions that provide no intuitive feedback. Meaning once came from proximity to consequence. Modern systems interpose layers. A decision made in one place affects lives elsewhere invisibly. Responsibility diffuses. The ancient system treated meaning as infrastructure. It was maintained deliberately. Symbols were reinforced. Narratives were renewed cyclically. Modern culture treats meaning as optional, subjective, or private. This creates vulnerability. Systems without shared meaning rely on enforcement alone. Enforcement scales poorly. Trust erodes. Compliance becomes fragile. The rise of conspiracy, extremism, and fragmentation reflects this vacuum. When official narratives lose credibility, people construct alternative meanings. These may be false, but they restore coherence. Belief matters more than accuracy. The Watcher's design avoided this by restricting narrative variance. Modern societies valorize expression without constraint. Diversity of meaning accelerates instability when not anchored to shared reality. This does not argue for suppression, but for alignment. Meaning must correspond to function. When stories promise infinite growth in a finite system, collapse is inevitable. Ancient myths warned against hubris not as moral failing, but as miscalculation. Overconfidence leads to exceeding limits. Punishment is consequence, not judgment. Modern narratives often deny limits entirely. Technology is cast as salvation. Growth is assumed perpetual. Constraints are framed as obstacles rather than conditions. This denial erodes resilience. When reality asserts itself, shock is severe. Populations unprepared for limitation react with panic or denial rather than adaptation. The ancient system mitigated shock through expectation. Collapse was anticipated. Flood myths normalized reset. Modern culture treats collapse as unthinkable. This makes recovery harder. Meaning also governs sacrifice. Ancient societies accepted loss to preserve continuity. Modern societies struggle to justify sacrifice without shared purpose. Short-term comfort overrides long-term survival. The Watcher's withdrawal transferred responsibility for meaning creation to humanity. This may have been the most difficult inheritance. Tools can be learned. Systems can be rebuilt. Meaning cannot be imposed without authority. Attempts to manufacture meaning through ideology, nationalism, or consumer identity often fail because they lack alignment with physical limits. When narratives collapse, cynicism spreads. Yet meaning can be reconstructed. It requires honesty about limits, shared responsibility, and visible consequence. Ancient systems achieved this through proximity. Modern systems must find new methods. The sky still offers orientation. Cycles still exist. Biology still enforces boundaries. Meaning anchored to these realities resists distortion. The tablets imply that coherence, once lost, is harder to restore than infrastructure. Buildings can be rebuilt. Trust cannot. This is why the Watchers embedded meaning into every layer of their system: architecture, ritual, law, and myth. Redundancy ensured survival. Modern civilization stripped meaning from systems in pursuit of efficiency. What remains is power without purpose. The final test is not technological, ecological, or economic. It is existential. Can humanity sustain participation in a system it no longer believes in? If not, collapse will not arrive as catastrophe, but as abandonment. Systems will fail because no one cares enough to maintain them. The ancient designers understood this. Their silence at this stage suggests that meaning cannot be engineered externally. It must emerge from recognition of reality. The fragments they left do not command belief. They invite understanding. Meaning, like constraint, must now be chosen. If humanity fails to choose it, no reset will follow. Only quiet dissolution, as coherence drains away and systems unravel from within. This is the point beyond which no record continues, not because nothing happens, but because no one remains aligned enough to record it. When coherence erodes and meaning fragments, the final mechanism that determines survival is choice. Not choice as freedom in the abstract, but choice as constraint. What is selected, what is rejected, and what is allowed to continue. The ancient system functioned because choice was limited. Options were bounded. Decisions occurred within predefined parameters. Modern civilization has removed those bounds while retaining the same stakes. Early oversight narrowed possibility deliberately. Humans were not asked what they wanted. They were assigned what worked. Agriculture followed seasons. Settlements followed water. Authority followed alignment. Choice existed, but only inside safe corridors. Outside them lay collapse. With oversight gone, choice expanded exponentially. Humans gained the ability to select systems, values, and futures without external correction. This was not presented as liberation in the ancient records. It was risk transfer. Freedom without structure requires judgment. Judgment requires understanding. Understanding requires limits. Modern civilization inverted this order, offering freedom before comprehension. This inversion manifests everywhere. Economic systems prioritize growth without ecological accounting. Political systems promise representation without long-term responsibility. Technological systems offer capability without ethical containment. Each choice compounds, interacting with others in ways no individual can see. The Watcher's system assumed choice would remain slow and local. A village could choose poorly without endangering the world. A king could fail without collapsing civilization. Modern choice operates at planetary scale. This creates a paradox. Humanity has never had more options, yet has never been more constrained by the consequences of choosing incorrectly. The margin for error has collapsed. Ancient texts frame this condition obliquely. They describe eras when the paths were many, and disorder followed. Multiplicity without hierarchy destabilized alignment. Restoration required narrowing choice again. Later traditions recast this as moral failure. In technical terms, it is decision overload. When systems exceed cognitive capacity, humans default to imitation, ideology, or denial. Choices are made based on identity rather than outcome. This accelerates divergence. The ancient system prevented this by embedding hierarchy everywhere: cosmic, social, symbolic. Modern societies resist hierarchy, equating it with oppression. Yet without functional hierarchy, systems drift. Hierarchy here does not mean dominance. It means ordering, knowing which constraints override others. In ancient systems, survival overrode preference, balance overrode ambition, continuity overrode expansion. Modern hierarchies often invert this. Short-term gain overrides long-term stability. Personal freedom overrides collective consequence. Speed overrides reflection. This inversion is not malicious. It is structural. Systems reward what they measure. Modern systems measure growth, engagement, and output. They rarely measure resilience, coherence, or restraint. The Watchers measured equilibrium. Their tools tracked balance across domains. Human systems track performance within silos. Cross-domain effects are externalized. Choice under these conditions becomes distorted. Decisions appear rational locally, while destructive globally. No individual intends collapse. Collapse emerges from aggregated rationality, misaligned with system limits. The ancient system addressed this through enforced pauses. Sabbaths, festivals, and taboos interrupted activity regardless of desire. They forced reflection and reset. Modern civilization treats interruption as inefficiency. The removal of enforced pause eliminates opportunities for collective course correction. Systems run until they fail. Choice also governs identity. Ancient humans derived identity from role. Modern identity is self-selected, fluid, and contested. This flexibility empowers expression but destabilizes coordination. Shared action requires shared reference. Without common reference, choices fragment. Consensus becomes impossible. Systems rely increasingly on force or automation to compensate. The Watcher's withdrawal assumed humanity would develop internalized constraint. Evidence is mixed. Some societies adopt sustainability principles voluntarily. Others accelerate extraction despite warning. The ancient records never suggest a final intervention to resolve this divergence. They imply observation continues, but authority does not. This reframes eschatology. The end is not predetermined. It is conditional. Outcomes depend on accumulated choice. No prophecy dictates collapse or survival. Only thresholds exist. Choice determines whether thresholds are crossed deliberately or accidentally. The most dangerous choices are not dramatic. They are habitual. Defaults chosen repeatedly become destiny. Infrastructure, once built, constrains future choice. Paths harden. Ancient builders understood this. Roads, canals, and walls channeled behavior for generations. Modern builders do the same digitally. Platforms, protocols, and standards shape action invisibly. Choosing what to build is choosing how future humans will choose. The Watchers designed with this in mind. They limited replication. They controlled access. They embedded breaks. Modern systems optimize replication. Successful designs spread instantly. Mistakes do too. This amplifies responsibility. Choice now affects people not yet born, across distances unimaginable to the ancient system. The ethical framework required for this scale does not yet exist. Ancient morality addressed local consequence. Modern ethics must address systemic impact. This gap defines the present moment. Humanity possesses tools designed for oversight without having evolved the oversight itself. The ancient system resolved this gap through authority. Modern humanity must resolve it through coordination. Whether coordination at this scale is possible remains unproven. The records offer no reassurance. They describe design, not outcome. They assume intelligence does not guarantee wisdom. Choice, then, becomes the final experiment. Not whether humanity can choose freely, but whether it can choose wisely under conditions of unprecedented power. Every system still operating reflects millions of small choices aligning enough to persist. Every failing system reflects misalignment accumulating beyond tolerance. There will be no signal announcing the decisive moment. No watcher will intervene. No tablet will be issued. The outcome will emerge quietly as defaults harden into inevitability. Choice will appear ordinary right up to the point it is no longer reversible. That is the condition the ancient designers left humanity in, not abandoned, but unguarded. The system no longer protects against error. It only records what is chosen and allows consequences to unfold without appeal. In this sense, humanity has inherited not a destiny, but a responsibility far heavier than any command ever was, and it cannot be delegated upward again. With responsibility now absolute and unshared, the final tension emerges between awareness and action. Humanity possesses unprecedented insight into its own systems, risks, and limits, yet repeatedly fails to translate that awareness into coordinated behavior. The ancient system assumed ignorance would be the primary obstacle. Modern civilization proves otherwise. Early oversight corrected error because humans could not see consequences clearly. Floods, resets, and restrictions compensated for limited perception. Today, data illuminates everything: climate trajectories, resource depletion, systemic fragility. Yet response remains fragmented. Knowledge no longer guarantees correction. This disconnect defines the present phase. Awareness without alignment produces paralysis. Every choice is contested. Every action is questioned. Delay becomes default. The ancient records never anticipated this condition. They assumed that once humans could see, they would act. Vision would compel adjustment. The Watchers opened the eyes, expecting behavior to follow. They did not account for denial as a survival strategy. Denial now operates structurally. Systems reward short-term stability even when long-term failure is visible. Individuals act rationally within local incentives while the global system drifts toward collapse. No single actor can reverse the trajectory alone, so action diffuses. The ancient system avoided this by centralizing authority. Correction did not require consensus. It required authorization. Modern humanity rejects centralized authority at planetary scale, but has not replaced it with functional coordination. This creates a governance gap. Problems exist at scales larger than any institution empowered to solve them. Climate, biosphere, and technological risk exceed national jurisdiction. Coordination requires trust across differences that systems have not cultivated. The Watcher's design embedded trust through hierarchy and shared cosmology. Humans trusted the system because it worked, and because dissent was limited. Modern societies prize dissent, but lack shared grounding. This tension erodes momentum. Every proposal triggers opposition. Every solution generates counter-narratives, action stalls. Meanwhile, systems continue operating. Inertia favors continuation. Collapse does not require intent. It requires only delay. The ancient tablets framed this dynamic indirectly. They warn against knowing the good and failing to do it. Knowledge without obedience destabilizes more than ignorance. Awareness increases responsibility faster than capability. This reframes guilt and accountability. Modern humanity is not failing because it lacks solutions, but because it cannot align around them. The burden is collective, but mechanisms for collective decision-making are inadequate. Technology exacerbates this. Communication amplifies disagreement faster than agreement. Algorithms reward engagement, not resolution. Conflict scales. Trust erodes. The Watcher's silence becomes more conspicuous here. Intervention would resolve alignment instantly. Authority would override debate. But that would invalidate autonomy. The experiment would end. Autonomy requires failure to be meaningful. Success without risk is compliance, not choice. This suggests the present impasse is not accidental. It is the cost of freedom at scale. Ancient systems externalized responsibility. Modern systems internalize it. The psychological weight is immense. Anxiety replaces certainty. Urgency competes with helplessness. The ancient builders mitigated this weight through ritual reassurance. Cycles promised renewal. Authority promised order. Modern narratives promise progress, but deliver uncertainty. Without credible future vision, societies default to preservation of the present, even when it is unsustainable. Fear of change outweighs fear of collapse. This is not irrational. Change concentrates pain. Collapse distributes it. Systems drift towards the latter. The Watcher's framework avoided this by enforcing early correction. Small resets prevented large ones. Modern systems delay correction until thresholds are crossed. This delay creates non-linear outcomes. When correction finally occurs, it is catastrophic. Yet catastrophe is not inevitable. The same awareness that fuels paralysis could enable coordination if aligned with shared purpose. The problem is not information, but meaning. Meaning must reconnect awareness to action. Without it, knowledge overwhelms. With it, sacrifice becomes acceptable. The ancient system supplied meaning externally. Modern humanity must generate it internally. This may require reframing survival not as avoidance of loss, but as continuation of participation. Systems persist only if people care enough to maintain them. Caring requires belief that action matters. That belief erodes when scale obscures impact. Relocalizing consequence may be necessary. Systems that reconnect action to outcome restore agency. This runs counter to globalization, but aligns with resilience. The ancient system balanced local autonomy with overarching constraint. Modern civilization must rediscover that balance without authority to impose it. This is not regression. It is adaptation. The Watchers' final withdrawal suggests they believed this adaptation possible, but not guaranteed. Intelligence was sufficient, but not decisive. The experiment reaches its critical phase when awareness is universal, but action is optional. At this point, the system no longer fails due to ignorance or malice, but due to indecision. History rarely records indecision as cause. It attributes collapse to villains or disasters. The ancient records are more precise. They describe drift. Drift is harder to confront because no one chooses it explicitly. It emerges from accumulation of deferred choices. The present moment is defined by such accumulation. Thresholds approach quietly. Feedback grows louder. Yet alignment remains elusive. The Watchers left no further instruction for this phase. They removed themselves precisely when guidance could no longer substitute for judgment. Humanity now stands fully exposed to consequence, not judged, not punished, simply answered. Answered by systems that respond to alignment or misalignment without emotion. The ancient designers understood this response well. They encoded it into stone, sky, and cycle. They withdrew to see whether humanity could read those signals without being told what they meant. Part 15 ends not with warning, but with observation. Awareness is complete. Action remains undecided. At the edge of complete autonomy, the system reaches a state the ancient records never attempted to resolve: self-determination without oversight. Everything prior was preparation, instruction, correction, withdrawal. What remains is not a test imposed from above, but a condition created from within. Civilization now exists in a closed loop where cause and consequence are no longer mediated. The final distinction between the ancient world and the present is feedback. Earlier systems provided immediate, legible response. Crops failed visibly. Floods erased cities unmistakably. Collapse was undeniable. Modern feedback is delayed, distributed, and abstract. Damage accumulates quietly, appearing as statistics long before it manifests as lived reality. This delay erodes urgency. When consequence feels distant, alignment weakens. The ancient designers relied on proximity between action and outcome to enforce restraint. That proximity has dissolved. Yet the underlying mechanics have not changed. Systems still obey limits. Energy still dissipates. Complexity still demands maintenance. The universe has not become forgiving simply because humans have become powerful. The Watchers' withdrawal transferred the burden of interpretation. No authority now translates signal into command. Humanity must read the environment directly and decide what it means. This requires humility, the willingness to accept correction without instruction. Humility is not a trait optimized by modern systems. Competition rewards dominance. Visibility rewards confidence. Admission of error is punished. These incentives conflict with systemic learning. The ancient framework avoided this by externalizing authority. Humans obeyed because the source was unquestionable. Modern autonomy removes that crutch. Learning must occur through consequence alone. This reframes collapse. Collapse is no longer failure of a plan. It is feedback delivered too late to adjust smoothly. It is learning by impact. The records suggest this outcome was anticipated. Oversight did not end because the system was stable, but because continued correction would prevent maturation. Dependence would persist indefinitely. Autonomy required exposure. This interpretation removes both comfort and blame. Humanity was not abandoned. It was released. Release does not guarantee success. It guarantees responsibility. The ancient system was not benevolent or cruel. It was pragmatic. Its goal was continuity. If continuity could not be achieved under guidance, it would not be achieved at all. This is why no final intervention is described. A last rescue would invalidate the entire process. It would confirm that humanity cannot self-regulate at scale. The silence at the end of the records is deliberate. Civilization now mirrors the structure once imposed upon it. Humans monitor, record, predict, and intervene in their own systems. Surveillance replaces watchers. Models replace prophecy. Institutions replace councils. The difference is coherence. Ancient oversight operated from unified purpose. Modern oversight fragments across competing interests. Tools are similar. Alignment is not. This does not doom the system automatically. It defines the challenge. Alignment must now emerge through shared understanding rather than imposed order. Shared understanding requires narrative, but narrative must correspond to reality. When stories diverge from constraint, they fail. The environment does not negotiate. The ancient myths encoded this truth. Towers fall when foundations are ignored. Floods come when balance is broken. These were not metaphors. They were compressed system warnings. Modern humanity decodes them too late or dismisses them as fiction. Yet the patterns repeat with mathematical consistency. The final inheritance is not knowledge of gods or watchers. It is literacy in systems. To survive, civilization must treat climate, ecology, technology, and economy as integrated domains, not separate debates. Decisions in one reverberate through all. This requires abandoning the illusion of control without responsibility. Power must be paired with restraint, not because it is virtuous, but because it is functional. The ancient system enforced restraint externally. Modern systems must embed it structurally. This is harder, slower, and uncertain. But it is possible. Resilience emerges when systems are designed to fail safely, to correct early, to localize damage. The ancient world practiced this instinctively. Modern civilization must relearn it deliberately. The future will not hinge on a single event. It will hinge on defaults. What systems prioritize when no one is watching? Defaults determine behavior when attention lapses. Ancient designers obsessed over defaults. They encoded them into calendars, rituals, and laws. Modern designers encode them into software, infrastructure, and incentives. Every default chosen today shapes humanity's ability to respond tomorrow. This is the quiet conclusion the records leave behind. Not prophecy, not warning, orientation. No watcher will return to approve or condemn. No tablet will update. The archive is closed. The experiment proceeds without supervision. Whether civilization stabilizes or collapses will not be decided by ideology, technology, or belief alone. It will be decided by alignment between what is built and what can be sustained. Alignment is not dramatic. It is incremental. It is boring. It requires saying no more often than yes. The ancient system understood this. Its greatest achievement was not monuments or cities, but limits. Modern civilization celebrates expansion. It must now learn contraction without panic. This does not mean retreating to the past. It means integrating the past's discipline into present capability. The Watchers are no longer relevant as entities. Their relevance survives only as a design philosophy. Observe carefully, intervene early, withdraw gradually, accept consequence. Humanity now occupies the role they once held, whether prepared or not. There is no external judge left, only systems responding exactly as designed. The outcome will not be announced. It will simply become the world that continues, or the one that does not. And that, finally, is the end of the record.